The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies, and by the Alltech Media Group, the region's leading multimedia video production and marketing company, creating powerful and innovative marketing strategies that deliver exponential returns.
Well, welcome to this continuing series we call the Randall Lewis Seminars. Actually took place last night, and by all who were in attendance, it really was an excellent evening. The topic title was Two California Cities Emerged from Bankruptcy, Lessons Learned, What Lies Ahead. Something like 482 cities in California. The number of bankruptcies has been very small. At least in recent times, it's really been three, and with an anomaly of Mammoth Lakes, Vallejo, Stockton, and in our city here in this region, San Bernardino. We thought it was particularly important for us in this region to learn the lessons from Vallejo and from Stockton. We're here as our guests with city managers of both cities. The 482 cities in California, we talked about it, 450 or so have city managers. I was asking students the other night, what are the forms of government? Maybe most people don't know. There's a strong mayor form and the city manager form. Is one of the great innovations in American governance has been the city managers, and they have a very proud history in California, and so we welcome you to this discussion. And I thought just so we know who you are, that beyond titles, if you could just give a brief word of biography, and we'll lead with Dan Keene, who's city manager of Vallejo, followed by Kurt Wilson, who's city manager of Stockton. Yeah.
Great, Ron. So I've been in city government in California for 32 years. Started out in the planning profession, worked in Southern California cities mostly. Became a city manager for the first time about 20 years ago in Orange County. And this is the fifth city that I have managed. I was recruited to Vallejo right after they exited from bankruptcy, and I saw this as a very worthy challenge at that point in my career, and it has turned out to be everything I hope for.
All right. Well, for me, I actually began most of my career in Southern California. This is where I grew up, so not far from here. So for me, I'm on my fourth city and have had two state agencies as well. So locally, I was formerly on the city council in Rialto.
I remember our discussion
Yes.
many years ago.
Quite a while ago. So I've gone through that side, and I actually worked for the city of San Bernardino for Pat Morris for a short while before I headed off to the state, then back to Southern California, and then back up to Sacramento again.
So, and you've been city manager of Stockton for how long now?
Let's see, well, I've been with Stockton for a little over 3 years, and I've been city manager for about 2 of those.
We thought the best way to do this is we could have a conversation, but I think for people who are watching this, they want to know what went on in Vallejo, what went on in Stockton, what are the outcomes, and I think those are two important. What went on, what are the outcomes, and I thought we'd spend a little time with each of you if you could tell us the story of bankruptcy in your city.
Okay. Well, so Vallejo's story, let's just first talk about a little bit about the city itself. For those people who don't know, Vallejo is a beautiful little community, or relatively large community up in the northern Bay Area. We are one of the first cities that was a capital in the state of California, 1867. We're about 30 miles from San Francisco across the bay. We have a population of 120,000. We have a median income of $68,000 a year, so it's on the low to middle income side. Our unemployment rate is a little higher than most of the Bay Area. We were the former home to the Mare Island shipyard, and that's an important part of Vallejo's story because that shipyard closed in 1997. We are also the home to some institutions of higher learning, like Cal State University Maritime Academy, Touro University. The city itself has about 500 employees, and we're a full-service city: police, fire, public works, economic development, and all of those administrative functions that we have to do. Starting with kind of a discussion about what got Vallejo into bankruptcy.
Why bankruptcy?
Yeah. So it starts with the fact that
we talk about it, all these cities are only three, really.
Well, there's only a handful today.
Yeah.
I think, we all know that the system of local government finance in California, I think, is frankly broken and not very effective for the services that we have to deliver to our residents of this state. The overwhelming majority of people in this state live in an incorporated city, and yet the finance structure that we have here is pretty inadequate to serve that. And that goes back a long years, and we'd probably a whole nother day. But Vallejo's story starts with the fact that we had a pretty weak tax base. This is a community. It was really oriented around the Mare Island property and the military presence there for more than 100 years. The city really was pretty dependent on that source. And when it closed in '97, it really took a lot of the lifeblood out of the community. But more importantly, over a series of years, the city entered into labor agreements with its employees that were, in retrospect, very inappropriate for that weak tax base. These were contracts that guaranteed very high incomes, benchmarking off of other communities, and fairly guaranteeing that Vallejo would always be near the top of the list when it came to comparisons of salaries. We offered extremely generous benefits. We had minimum staffing provisions in police and fire departments, which required us to maintain more staff than we could afford. We had binding arbitration so that when there were disputes, it was frequent that the city lost those disputes. And at the end of the day, what pushed Vallejo into bankruptcy was our inability to renegotiate those contracts. Vallejo, like a lot of cities, is made up of people. I mean, it's a city. And so, well more than 70 to 75, 80% of our budget is paying for pay and benefits. And that's not unusual. And it's appropriate. That's what we do. We provide services. But when you can't address that major cost center, you're going to have trouble. And that's what happened in Vallejo. The city entered into Chapter 9 bankruptcy in May of 2008. I will tell you up front, and I'm sure we'll say this again and again, this is nothing that I would recommend as a process. It was extremely difficult, very expensive. We expended over $12 million during that time. Lawyers and consultants and court costs and all sorts of things that you must do. And as one of the first cities, really the first large city in California to go through it, we were trailblazing, I suspect. But I know from the experience of others, those numbers they don't go down. We've faced challenges at every step of the way. The labor unions, the retirees whose pay and benefits were affected, who challenged us. They challenged our eligibility to enter into bankruptcy. They challenged our ability to reject the labor contracts. Ultimately, the bankruptcy court sustained sustained our position, and we entered into a plan of adjustment, which led to our exiting bankruptcy in November of 2011. And about 3 months later, I was coaxed into coming to the city.
So the length of time of bankruptcy was how long?
About 3 years.
About
a little
3
over
years.
3 years, 3.5 years. Yeah, 3.5 long years. So the impact on employees was pretty dramatic. We had to renegotiate virtually every contract. In some cases, it was not probably a negotiation as much as an imposition. Lots of salary reductions, furloughs, reduced staffing. We dramatically reduced a very generous retiree medical benefit that was really at the root, one of the roots of our cost overruns. We required employees to share in a greater cost of their benefits. And the upshot has been, since the bankruptcy and going through bankruptcy and since, we really had no meaningful adjustments to pay and benefits for any of our employees. And we still are looking at a situation where we don't see that on the horizon. So you can imagine morale really took a hit. And the organization that I inherited when I came on board was clearly reeling from those years during bankruptcy. So our recovery is really about 5 things, and one of the biggest is that you have to know what it is you're facing down the road. I think what happened in Vallejo is that a lot of decisions were made over years where nobody had sat down and said, look, this decision you're making today is going to cost you a lot of money down the road. And so accuracy in your financial reporting and the data that you have available is and still is the highest priority in our community. We spent a lot of time working on a 5-year forecast, and now we're expanding that out into 10 years to make sure we know reasonably know every future cost increase, and that we've programmed that in before we make judgments about our budget. We're making sure that we give budget updates regularly as a routine event rather than as a crisis. We have regular discussions with actuarial consultants to help us test our assumptions and make sure that those assumptions accurately reflect the world, and they are the most conservative. We're more conservative, frankly, than some of the state entities that we deal with, because we don't want to err. We want to err on the side of being very conservative, because experience has shown that was the right way to go. And then, of course,
so often, I guess, in decisions we look at where we are now rather than look at where we're going to be. Right? And, so you're focusing attention to the electeds and the community on not only what you're this year, but what those decisions are going to mean in the future.
It's the nature of the beast, isn't it? That as cities, we are dealing with the problem that's in front of us today. And city managers, by profession, we're problem solvers, and so we're kind of tuned to go solve that problem of today. But often what happens is we don't have the tools or the viewpoint that says, look, we need to look way down the road, maybe 4, 5, 6 years down the road, because we can make decisions today that can actually affect us that far down the road, and things happen.
So that really is one of the major lessons of this bankruptcy.
No question. Got to have good financial reporting. We need to have timely financial reporting. In Vallejo's case, part of our story were the voters. Surprisingly, I think, and to the community's credit, the voters stepped up to help the city recover. They affirmed a utility user tax that had been on the books since in November 2009. They removed binding arbitration from the city charter, 2010. They approved a new tax right as we were leaving bankruptcy, a 1-cent tax. They approved a tax, 10-year tax. And they approved a medical marijuana tax at the same time. So these were narrowly approved. I mean, these were barely done. But it has turned out to be a very important part of our ability to restore services. Hasn't put us back on that footing that I would say we are fully recovered, but it's certainly a lot better. One of the other things we've done, and I would say is a common element in cities that get into trouble, is communication. Vallejo wasn't doing a great job of communicating with its public, with its community, with its residents, its employees, and so we introduced a whole lot of things right after I came on board to push information out to the public on a routine basis. So that instead of having a crisis communication that maybe would be lost, we have a regular dialogue. We give a lot of very important and sometimes mundane information out, but it's very well read. And it's really had a positive impact.
You do this through the internet, or
a lot of social media, almost all social media. But some of it old school. Neighborhood Watch, for example, we had 8 groups. We now have 258. We had no Neighborhood Watch from. Now the community really kind of stood up for itself and said, we're going to protect ourselves. We're going to form Neighborhood Watch. We embrace that. We support it, and it's really a great avenue for us to communicate directly at a very intimate level.
Yeah, well, last night you talked about the importance of civic engagement. That's one marker in Vallejo was the Neighborhood Watch.
I think apathy is absolutely an element in any community that ends up in fiscal trouble. When people stop paying attention at all levels, that's when things can get awry, and this is a symptom of it. Rebuilding trust, we did a lot. I would say we're always working to rebuild the trust of our community, being very transparent about our budgets, adopting structurally balanced budgets. One of the other things we did was something called participatory budgeting. It was something that had been tried out in New York and Chicago. It was brought to my council by a former council member, Marty Brown. It was controversial at the time. It was right after we'd adopted that tax, and the council ended up that first year setting aside $3.2 million of this brand new tax and saying essentially to the community, you help us decide how to spend that money. We've continued to do that now for a couple of years. We get a lot of positive feeling in the community. It's a fun process. It's not easy.
Are many other cities in California have that?
Well, I don't know. I know a lot of cities have talked to us about introducing it. It has a lot of appeal in a lot of different ways because empowering the community to be involved in the budget
I can
is
go,
something that
I can go
breaks
online
them up.
into the Vallejo website and find out.
Oh yeah. Lots of stuff about participatory budget. In fact, we have our own website there that you can get right to. You can see all the links, and we have a staff there that's happy to talk to people about participatory budgeting. Sure. Fiscal discipline, I mean, it goes without saying, we don't adopt unbalanced budgets anymore. I know that sounds almost hard to believe, but one of the obvious things that got us into trouble as a city was adopting budgets that relied on one-time revenues, reserves. Depleting reserves is one of those big red flag markers that says something is wrong here. If you're spending down your reserve and it's for routine things, that's a problem. We don't do that. We fully pay our debts going forward to PERS and to OPEB. We're rebuilding our reserves. And we've had to continue to make tough decisions. The City Council in 2013 actually ended up imposing a new contract on the police department. Obviously that didn't go over well. We're still in litigation over that. That tax that was passed, instead of just folding that into the budget, we set aside all $13 million of that revenue every year. And we ensure that that money is only spent to augment and to restore services that were cut. So it isn't going back into salaries and benefits. You can imagine that, that's not exactly an easy political decision or one that's easy for us to sell to employees. So a lot of fiscal discipline, a lot of tough conversations. So talking about the lessons learned.
Yeah, what are the lessons learned?
Yeah. So first of all, Chapter 9 bankruptcy is nothing I would recommend as a city manager to any community if they're thinking this is an easy way out, because it's not. It's difficult, it's expensive, it takes a long time, and the impacts are really long lasting. I've been in Vallejo now not quite 4 years. We're still talking about this all the time. We talk to other communities, we talk to communities all over the country. And when Vallejo is referenced in the news, it's often prefaced with Vallejo, which exited bankruptcy in 2011, blah, blah, blah. Rebuilding and maintaining trust in the community is absolutely essential. We wouldn't be where we are today if the community didn't take a deep breath and realize that, okay, we're moving forward from here. Having that accurate data, having the ability to recognize all of your current and your future costs is absolutely critical. Vallejo today, we're still dealing with a lot of hard decisions. And one of the lessons I like to point to is that it takes both political courage and strong leadership to make good things happen in bankruptcy. Vallejo went through a period of almost ridiculous instability, 15 city managers over a 20-year period prior. You can't manage a city and you can't deal with these kinds of problems if you've got that kind of instability. And that's a credit to the elected officials who really recognized, okay, we have to have that stability. We have to work with the manager and his team, and we need to hire good people and make this a joint effort. So that's something that I really think is super important. And then finally, there were hard choices that you made in bankruptcy, but there's a lot more to come. It's not over when you exit bankruptcy. In fact, it's just the start of a story that goes, beyond that.
So the band plays and people cheer and you don't live happily ever after.
No. I mean, today Vallejo is a place that is slowly recovering from the recession. We're slower than most, I would say most communities in the Bay Area. Proposition 13, even though it was passed 30 years ago, almost 30 years, still having its impact.
Comment on the obvious, and we'll start to this, that you want to be a safe city, you want to have a city that has good amenities and people have good judgments about, but in some ways you don't have the kind of revenues that you would like to achieve some of your objectives.
Well, yeah. One thing we have to be very upfront about, those future cost increases, that weak revenue base, those costs, those expenses that we paid out, all of those decisions have an impact today. We don't have the services that we should have for a city of 120,000 people. We're going to continue to be squeezed by that. That lack of revenue growth is going to continue to affect our ability to adequately pay our employees. We're beginning to fall behind. It's difficult to recruit for certain positions. We're starting to see a lot of trouble there because we can't maintain the market. There are a lot of other communities in the Bay Area who are recruiting for staff. I mean, it's a hot employment market, and we're starting to see that. Our infrastructure investment is way behind. I mean, we need to put something like $6 to $7 million a year into street maintenance. We're managing about $3 million, and that's just to stay pace. So we're falling behind. It's going to take a long time, and the stigma of bankruptcy is just always a part of our story.
Dan, thanks very much for your overview of Vallejo. Again, what was important last night was to begin to compare and contrast the experiences of Vallejo with the city of Stockton. So, Eric, welcome. Tell us a little bit about sort of who you are and maybe a little bit your roots down in this area. And then the Stockton story on bankruptcy.
Certainly. So right in this area between Rialto and San Bernardino is really where I learned local government. It's where I sort of cut my teeth, if you will, on the local government process. So I understand the area very well. And even though I've been gone for almost 10 years, many of the same people are still in this area. So I'm familiar with the people and the issues. So I follow the local issues very closely.
You were an elected official, right?
I was, yes, for the city of Rialto.
Yeah. Not many elected officials become our city manager of Riverside. John Russo is a former elected,
that's right.
Both councilman and city attorney.
That's right. In fact, I first met John when he was the city attorney and also the president for the League of California Cities.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So Stockton is in the northern Central Valley. So we're the 13th largest city in California, population of about 300,000. So demographically, we're actually somewhat similar to San Bernardino, but with the size of Riverside. So we've got some of the same challenges that happen here in the Inland Empire, but we have a few things that are different. We were talking earlier, one of the obvious differences is water. We happen to have water everywhere, which is unique for us.
Wait, Stockton, you just mentioned that, because one of the things that I think is dumbfounding to people here is that Stockton's actually a port.
Absolutely.
Right?
So the
There's-
the largest inland deep water port. So we have ships coming through to China and the Baltic literally several times a week. We have a tremendous amount of trade that comes right through Stockton.
Which I think most people just...
They passed through Vallejo before
Oh,
they point that out.
Yeah, so we have a tremendous amount of commerce that works its way through. So we're, because of the Central Valley roots, we have a large agricultural component, but we also have a pretty substantial distribution manufacturing. So we have a large number of Fortune 500 companies who have ties right there in Stockton or headquarters because they can have the goods movement between the freeway, the rail, and the water to get out that way. Good. So we have essentially a number of things that happened in Stockton that are very similar to Vallejo. So bankruptcy itself, I think, is confusing for people because they worried, oh my goodness, am I going to be just going along fine and all of a sudden I'm bankrupt one day? And that's not the case. So bankruptcy happens when you essentially lose sight of the fundamentals, just the plain basics that you would normally think of. Making sure that you're budgeting a certain way, that you're not using one-time revenues to pay for ongoing things, that you don't ignore the long-term cost, the regular basics that people do even in their home budgets. So cities go bankrupt when they lose sight of the basics, and they do so over a long period of time. So no, you don't get to bankruptcy by a single bad decision. You do it by creating a culture where you ignore the basics or you make politically expedient choices rather than make the difficult choices.
Yeah, and that's really a very powerful observation, because I think people tend to think of bankruptcy as some a single event
Right.
or a single mistake. But
Absolutely not. And if you look back, and that's another one of those similarities you'll see with Vallejo. In fact, you'll see with San Bernardino as well. This is something that could have been seen coming for a long time. And in fact, when you really go back, you find that there were warning signs. In fact, people even mentioned those warning signs. But making a difference in status quo is a very difficult thing, and it comes at a price. So if you're a city manager, being the person that tells your elected officials, your bosses, no, you can't afford that. I know this is very important to you, but you just can't do it, is the kind of thing that can lose you your job. And if you're an elected official, telling those citizens who put you there, no, you can't have, that pothole filled, this so-and-so, will also get you unelected. So not every person who's in these positions is willing to make those difficult decisions. But I can tell you that if you don't make those difficult decisions, they're not going to get better on their own. But as difficult as it is now to make the hard decisions, it's not going to get better. And it means that it may outlast your tenure, the next budget cycle, the next election, but somebody's going to have to deal with that. The recession hit Stockton very hard, but it wasn't just the recession that put Stockton into bankruptcy, because the recession hit everyone, and other people managed to get through it. The difference was Stockton, for so long, had made those bad decisions, deferred those hard things, and got into a spot where it really didn't have the structure. It wasn't able to withstand the recession the same way that other people did.
You mentioned, I think, last night the value of homes went remarkably down in Stockton. Is that?
Absolutely. So in some cases, you would have a home that was worth $400,000, and at the height of the recession, the value of that home dropped to $118,500. So for a family, a property owner, being their largest investment, that was a devastating thing to begin with. And then even for the government agencies who rely on that property tax, they end up having to reduce services in a commensurate way. So the poor family is stuck with not only dealing with their own issue, but now receiving less services from their city as a result of it for something that they didn't do. So the bankruptcy process itself, I agree with Dan that bankruptcy is not an option that I would recommend to anyone, as long as you have a choice.
Yeah, I was going to ask this later, but I wanted to start with the Dan comment. There was an article in Governing Magazine written by Liz Farmer called "The B Word: Is the Stigma of Municipal Bankruptcy Going Away?" And she was suggesting bankruptcy may be a choice for cities. And,
No, I think anyone who's been closely involved with that process will tell you, without exception, bankruptcy is not a choice you make. It is the most painful process you can put your community through. It's the most embarrassing thing you can go through for the employees, for the community. It's something, the anxiety that comes along with it is immeasurable, and you just can't get out of that.
The article suggests the reason cities are going to do that is to get out of their pension difficulties. And the answer to that is?
Absolutely not. And I think if you take a closer look, I don't want to get too technical here, but if you take a closer look at the process, and in the Stockton case, our judge made the most comprehensive evaluation of the pension analysis that anybody has ever made from the bench. And the short version was yes, throughout the bankruptcy process, you can essentially get out of your obligation with CalPERS in our case. But it does nothing for you going forward, and it's not as if the bankruptcy process can somehow impose a new ongoing obligation on PERS. So as a practical matter, in our case, after analyzing it, the judge agreed, yes, you could do it, but I agree with you, it makes no sense.
So both for Stockton and Vallejo, you did not change the relationship with CalPERS?
Correct.
Right. No.
Instead, what we did is we looked at the variables. So the amount of money that's paid to CalPERS is based on a number of variables, some of which are marginally within our control. Every one of those that were within our control, we did reduce. So ultimately, as a result of the bankruptcy process, we are paying less to CalPERS, but we didn't do it by having the judge enforce some imaginary order. We did it through the regular rules. So the lead up to bankruptcy, like I said, it really comes down to just doing those things of when you're trying to force the fit and trying to do something that you simply can't afford. Budgeting in some respects, is a balance between what people deserve and what you can afford. To the extent that people, whether it's labor negotiations or purchases, make it based on what people deserve, that's going to satisfy the short term, and people are going to be very happy because they got that raise, that new building got built, whatever, they got the extra services and the extra potholes filled. So they're very happy in the short term. In the long term, however, that's where the problem lies, because if you can't afford it, you simply can't afford it. So making those obligations that go beyond what you can actually afford are very difficult.
Was sort of an outside criticism of Stockton was the amount of money invested at fixing up the ports and arenas and
right. Well, the port's separate from us, and
right.
and actually the port has managed to even though they have taxing authority, they've never actually used it, so they're actually thriving at the moment. But yes, the city did choose to make some very substantial investments that never penciled out. And they were risks based on what people wanted and what people felt they deserved rather than what we could afford. And those were contributing factors. So labor was a factor for Stockton, but not the sole factor.
A somewhat different story than the
Yes.
story of Vallejo.
Right.
Somewhat. It seems like Stockton's story is a combination of some of Vallejo's issues
Yes.
and then some that were unique to Stockton. We both had the same issue with employee benefits and salaries. I mean,
Exactly.
That was the root, and that tipped us over the edge.
We had a very similar set of above market compensation issues that we over the years had provided to employees and to retirees. Yeah. The most glaring would be retiree medical.
Give this story. If I worked for Stockton
Yeah.
for one day or something?
Yeah, so depending on which group you were in, if you worked for one day and then retired, that would make you eligible for lifetime retiree medical benefits for you and your spouse. And Stockton has a self-funded plan, so this wasn't an 80-20 plan. This was as good as it gets as far as medical plans. So that's one of those things the city could no longer afford. So one school of thought is, hey, that makes sense. You're scaling it back to what's normal. But to be fair, from the employees, that's different than what they signed up for.
Right.
So for them, the rug was sort of pulled out from under them. Retirees, the city never pre-funded any of those benefits. So it's similar to a pension benefit, except with pensions you pre-fund it, and the bulk of the money from investment earnings is what pays the bill, rather than pay as you go.
From the outside, Kurt, it seemed to me Stockton got in and out quite relatively quickly, and the council was together with the manager in that process going through. Is that?
It was one of the reasons that I agreed to come is I saw my predecessor Bob Dice and the council, the majority of the council and mayor at the time were resolute. I saw them making some very difficult decisions to make sure that everything was in the best interest of the organization. And seeing that type of uniformity and just being willing to make whatever decision they had to is part of what attracted me to the city.
Yeah. Maybe it's the outside. I gave some applause to the electeds and the manager in that process.
That did. That was an extraordinary group. So they really, really stepped up. And even though some of them took some, it came at a personal cost. It was in the best interest of the organization, and that's good public service. So for us, the compensation packages, like Dan said, are very similar. We had a lot of things in common that way with Vallejo. I'm not even sure we realized it at the time, but it was after we went back, we saw the similarities there. But because we went through the process after Vallejo did, we benefited greatly from the lessons learned from Vallejo.
You said the consultants and lawyers were
absolutely
used
the same people.
Yeah, so we had some very experienced folks because they had just spent the last few years working through the same process. So it certainly worked out well to our advantage. Having experienced, there are a lot of lawyers who do bankruptcy, very few who've ever done a Chapter 9 case, because there have been very few Chapter 9 cases ever. So that worked out very well for us. And coming out of bankruptcy, we realized it wasn't just a cash issue. So we had, whether it was infrastructure, streets and roads or even just financial systems, some of those things, we were very behind times. So it was important for us to come up with a plan that not only got us out of the red, but had a plan to address those issues, because for the long-term sustainability, we're not a private company. We're not going to go away tomorrow. We have to make sure that we're able to go forward and do those things. And we were able to have an exit plan that addressed each of those things so that we're working toward the full solvency beyond just the cash.
In some states, if a city gets in bankruptcy, the state takes it over. I mean, Detroit is the most visible example. And California does that for school districts. What's your position of having the state do that for cities?
I'm not sure there would be much benefit, largely because having worked both for the state and for local government, I would say that at the state level, there's an absence of familiarity with how local government actually works. So that said, I'm not sure how much added benefit the state would be able to bring forward.
Well, I would add that, when a city goes into bankruptcy, the solutions need to be local. The impacts will absolutely be local. And I think that one big disadvantage of having a state entity come in and take over is that now you're diminishing even further that connection between community and the solution. And I've seen that in school districts. There's always a lot of anger over we don't have any control. There's one person who's overseeing this, and he or she makes all of the decisions. That's not how we came out of bankruptcy. That's not what's rebuilt trust. I think it just would set it back. I don't think that's a help at all.
And in Chapter 9 specifically, one of the many differences from, say, Chapter 11 is that the City Council throughout that process never actually loses the ability to make spending decisions. So even during the bankruptcy process, they're still the ones that are making the call, writing the checks, and doing those things. Ultimately, the judge is going to weigh in if he thinks anything was inappropriate when he approves the plan.
Once the plan of bankruptcy is approved by the judge is it that he says, is there some monitoring the judge does?
Yes, so
that?
there's a continuing jurisdiction that effectively lasts until the entire implementation of the plan. So in our case, we have some debt that we restructured that'll go out to, say, the year 2053. So technically the court does retain a jurisdiction throughout that entire time.
If you want to modify what was in the plan, do you go back to the court to do that?
Well, technically you could, but a change from that would reopen the entire process
and
negotiations and voting and do all those things. Yes.
Don't use that as a tool.
Yeah, it's a painful process.
And
yes.
it's expensive.
Okay,
yes. So in our case, we're actually going through an appeal at the moment. So we have an active appeal we have a single creditor who was unhappy with the outcome and is exercising their appeal rights. So we're going through that piece as well. So we have the continuing jurisdiction from the regular court, the primary court, and we're also continuing the other process through the appellate level as well.
Yeah. Major lessons from Stockton for going through this process?
Don't ignore the early warning signs. Like I said, bankruptcy, we don't wish it on anyone, but if you ignore things long enough, you find yourself in a position where there's no alternative.
Well, last night there was a good question, and maybe it's an obvious question, but for people who live in a city, they want to know how things are going. If you ask people who are running the city, I think the general response is everything is fine. We're doing good work. For attentive groups or attentive public or people who want to look at this kind of status of the city's finances, how do I do that?
Well, there are a number of ways. Admittedly, for a layperson, it is difficult to find the funny business that may be going on. But one of the best avenues is to take a look at the audited financial reports because you have an outside.
Those are online, and I could
generally.
Yeah,
yes.
They should be.
I mean, that's one of that would be one of the first things I would say is transparency.
Yes.
Are those documents, the budget, the financial reports, Are there understandable documents posted online that explain the budget? This may not be popular with some of my colleagues in this profession, but if you're not starting with that, then it certainly suggests that you don't want to talk about something. And I think in any community that is in trouble, there can be a tendency to circle the wagons and let's hold on tight to the information. That's really exactly the opposite of what I would recommend. I think you have to be you have to bend over backwards to be more public about what your situation is than less, because if you don't, you're simply just creating the seeds of distrust and probably
I'd agree.
getting yourself into decisions that you shouldn't be making.
You mentioned last time the League of California Cities has one kind of tool. Actually, we had the city manager of San Bernardino was there last night, and he mentioned something else that is also a tool.
Yeah, he mentioned there's a third-party software called OpenGov, is what he was talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The League of California Cities, which is virtually all cities in California members, has a great resource that they've developed. It's sort of a financial analysis tool that cities can use to take a look at these fundamentals. It's a tool that is accessible to the public as well. And lots of cities have gone through the process of filling in the blanks and looking at what that results. So it's a tool. It's not the only tool, but it's certainly one, because we all recognize that there are the seeds of this problem in Vallejo and Stockton and San Bernardino exist in other parts of California.
We were talking about this, I don't know, the controller, somebody at the state level is doing these sort of look at audit. They're auditing all cities, or just there were some 6 cities were on this list. How did
I'm not sure their actual criteria. For us, everybody and their brother has been through to audit Stockton, so we sort of pay it no mind at the moment because there's nothing left to find. But I don't recall the specifics.
Yeah, I've only seen what has popped up in the media recently. It's a bill that passed in earlier this year, and I think it's an entree for the state to get involved in at least red flagging whether a city or a public agency. 'Cause I don't think it's just focused on cities. I think it also talks about other public agencies. But it's a way for the state to say, hey, there's a problem here, and then there's a process for them to go in and actually go into a city or agency and do more analysis.
I mean, cities are relevant. I mean, cities have constituencies and open council meetings. There's attention, but there's a major article today in the LA Times talking about a water districts, which are
special districts.
Yes, and not running well, and I think the state finally going in and took a look at it. And
special districts are unique in that each level of government has their own sort of face. Local government with the city, for example, we have probably the highest public interaction. So people know where we are, they come out to complain to us about things, but a special district is not really on the radar for most people. So they have much less public scrutiny or public interaction than a city would.
Somebody wants to discover this phantom government.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet many of the same things that happen in cities happen in special districts and can happen and with similar impacts, maybe more severe if you consider that they're single purpose, in many cases single purpose. And so the loss of a major piece of the local service infrastructure can be devastating, and they deserve the same kind of attention, I would say.
One of the obvious questions that are asked is, how is Stockton different now after bankruptcy? And the same question, how is Stockton different now after bankruptcy?
Well, on the bad side, we have a much lower service level, but on the good side, we're much more stable. So while there's a longing for people to say, hey, we want to go back to where we were pre-bankruptcy. The challenge is, the reality is, we were very unhealthy pre-bankruptcy. Whether or not people realized it or acknowledged it, we were unhealthy and unstable. So today we're very healthy, very stable. We're growing, we're recovering. Our future is looking very good, but it's largely because our foundation now is very solid.
One of the things that happened in Vallejo that surprised me when I came there was how resilient the community and the organization was. Having gone through 3.5 years of bankruptcy, he was saying, bankruptcy is embarrassing, and to live in a community where your community's gone bankrupt and where your friends from other parts of country, you're saying, oh, you live in a bankrupt city. What I found was that the community really rallied around. And so today we are a much more engaged community. We have a lot closer relationship. Those residents were angry to be painted with this brush that somehow they were inferior because we went through bankruptcy. So today I think we're a much more resilient community. We do have the same problems. The service levels are woefully below where they should be, and it'll take us a long time to rebuild that. But the economy's helping, and the economy's helped a lot. Those taxes have helped a lot. We've used those taxes in a way that have augmented services. We've rebuilt our police department to some semblance. We've reopened fire stations. We're putting a lot more money in street repairs. So we're on our road back, but it's going to be a long road.
Same story?
Absolutely. We're rebuilding very slowly, but we've sort of got everything planned in, and we have our basics covered. And when things go our way, in fact, next week we're going to be able to plug a few more holes that we hadn't done before.
One of the puzzles for me as I've looked at this, I'm teaching a class this quarter, we're looking at after bankruptcy in San Bernardino, it was, where do you look for community leadership to get involved in this? Where did the community leadership step up and stand out, and maybe both Vallejo and Stockton in this process? Chamber groups, or nonprofit groups, or neighborhood groups, or community of faith, or where do you find leadership?
I have a great story to tell. In Vallejo, we have our challenges, crime rates, and so on. And when we dropped so far below, our staffing levels, we started to just see crime coming to the community, and particularly prostitution and burglary and those sorts of things. And the community stepped up and said, we are not going to let this happen to our community. And they formed their own groups to combat this, and to do it in cooperation with the police department, but to augment it. And so we have hundreds of volunteers now participating in our government. I would say that's one form of leadership. The people that routinely come to our council meeting and challenge us on the budget every time we adopt a budget, those are community leaders. Obviously our chamber, but our neighborhood associations, we went from 8 neighborhood watch groups to 258. We have those are the roots of what's going to hold Vallejo together going forward, along with effective political and management leadership.
Okay, very important message. In Stockton, where did leadership come from?
It actually came from basically everywhere. So in addition to having the same concept of voters approving the tax to enhance some things, we have very strong chamber, but we've got individuals. We have a large number. We have some very, very wealthy individuals in town.
Stockton Forward still in place?
Still in place. So we have, Stocktonians are a very strong group and very committed group, and they love Stockton, and they really are willing to give their all for it. So it really came from every corner. Every segment of the population really stepped up.
In Bell, actually, which is often a sign of failure, it's also seemed to me a marker of success, because after this, the Bell community really, there was an enormous civic engagement that took place.
Yeah, I think it's a common thread in most communities that go through particularly difficult times where it feels like everybody else is attacking. One of the unfortunate things that happens for Vallejo is that we always get mentioned with bankruptcy in there, and anytime anybody in the United States is considering bankruptcy, they're on the phone to us. The press is calling, what was that like? For the residents of our community, for the businesses, they rallied around that. They don't talk about bankruptcy. They talk about what a great community this is, what a great opportunity it is to come and live here, the beauty of our community, and the hidden secret. And so if there's a silver lining, again, I'd never recommend this as a way to develop this kind of closeness, but it has brought our community together in a way that probably wouldn't happen.
And the same experiences as
absolutely. If we had the strength to stand up and make those difficult decisions slightly earlier, we could have avoided bankruptcy. But because we waited so long, there was no other option. But once we were in it, we really made the best of it to make sure that we came out for the long haul.
Well, this very important stories. One of the other lessons seems to me is you do need good management, and the importance of the role of the city manager in providing information and shared governance. San Bernardino is now well into its third year, and recommendations you'd make you're away from the specifics, but at a distance, what recommendations you make for? It's the second largest city in inland Southern California. What recommendations would you make? Maybe.
Vallejo first.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's some of the same things that we have talked about here today. Being transparent about how you're going to solve the really tough problems that they're facing, recognizing and acknowledging up front that there will be tough choices that will not satisfy everyone, and that the solutions have to be a combination of employees plus community plus elected officials making those tough decisions, doing things to rebuild trust. It will take time to rebuild the confidence that the community has in their political and their staff leadership. Recruiting, I'm not going to get into who they should hire, but they should definitely pay attention to the kind of leadership that they recruit as they replace their city manager there, to make sure that they're of a like mind, and that they're in this for the right reasons. That this is going to be a different kind of city management job. I think both of us are this is not a normal kind of city manager job. When you go into a city that's been through this, and it takes a certain personal resilience as well as support from the elected officials. And hopefully San Bernardino will recognize the importance of stability as an ingredient to getting out of this, because you can't have the revolving door, and you need stability at the manager level, but also that person needs the stability to hire the right people and who are interested in the challenge that a community like San Bernardino is going to represent.
You know the place, Kurt. I mean, it's
I do.
not beyond news stories. What would you recommend?
There are two things. The first is take ownership of the situation, which means you're past the oh, we shouldn't be here, gosh, I wish we weren't here, and you're already here. You're going through the pain, you're going through the embarrassment, so don't go halfway. Have the strength, dig deep to get the strength to make sure that when you come out of it very well, and not just halfway coming out of it, because the worst scenario would be to have gone through all this horrible pain and have nothing to show for it. If you're going to have the pain, you should make sure you come out very well on the other side.
And that's the plan that you need to submit.
Absolutely. Okay. But it's bigger than the plan. I mean, it's really the culture of the organization, which is the second point of within the city manager. The city manager is arguably the linchpin in all of this, because that's the one person who has the access to the full resources. That's who has this full professional staff of experts and has the best information. So if that manager doesn't come forward with that, then that's the problem of the manager. The elected officials deserve to know the right information. So the manager's got to be able to get that there.
But they really have to be a team, right? The manager and the council
they
and
do. They're in. This is a family.
Need to be together.
This is a family.
There's no other way. There's no way that works.
And assuming in San Bernardino, it's time to sort of put aside differences and rally around the party, right?
San Bernardino's had a very difficult political history, but that doesn't mean it can't have a very good political history going forward. But that's not going to come easy. It's going to take some real sacrifice from a lot of people.
Well, after last night and talking to people, they thank you very much for the clarity, and I think the significance of your comments. It also underscored the role that good city managers play, and it was an inspiring evening last night, and your comments today are equally on target proud of city managers. If I was living in Vallejo, I'd be proud of my city manager. If I was living in Stockton, I'd be proud of my city manager. We've presented the cities well, and the emphasis on bankruptcy is now passed. We're now moving forward, and with lessons learned. And I think the other thing where I had not been helpful to electeds is looking beyond the simple budget of what's our budget for this year, and trying to understand the connections between what making choices this year have to do with what choices you'll be able to make in 3, 5, 10 years. But thank you very much. It was an honor to have you last night. It was an honor to have you in this conversation. So thanks.
Thanks for having us.
An honor to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
For information or questions about this program, to learn more about future programming planned for the Randall Lewis Seminar Series, or to register and/or receive email announcements from UCR's Center for Sustainable Suburban Development, please contact the center at 951-827-7830 or email at shana.conaway@ucr.edu. This program is brought to you by the following proud sponsors: the Alltech Media Group, the region's leading multimedia video production and marketing company, creating powerful and innovative marketing strategies that deliver exponential returns.